Our next topic here is diving into an energy source, one that we're starting to hear a lot more about, and one that I think a lot of Marylanders will benefit from learning about here. And so, joining us today is Tim Judson. Tim has served as the executive director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service since 2014, after joining as associate director in 2013. He leads NIRS work on nuclear energy and climate issues and has authored reports on nuclear bailouts and sustainable energy and helped close the Vermont Yankee reactor as chair of the Citizens Awareness Network. Tim also co-founded the New York Alliances for a Green Economy. So, Tim, I'm excited to have you here today talking with us. And it's okay. I'm going to turn it over to you. And anytime you need to advance the slides, go ahead and let me know. And if you see me pop on for any reason, it's because we have a timely question that I want to try to get in there as we're moving. So, Tim, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And then thanks to everybody for being here and for having me today. So I've been asked to cover a lot of different topics here, and so I'm going to move pretty fast through some of these slides, just to make sure that we've got enough room or enough time for Q&A at the end. But why don't we just dive right in? Let's go to the next slide. So, just as a sort of general overview, so nuclear power, has been a stagnant industry in the U.S. for several decades now. It provides about 17.8% of the electricity in the country as of 2024, and that share is probably declining. It's from a peak of providing about 22.5% in the mid 1990s. And as we, I think, all are sort of aware that, the growth of renewables has been really extraordinary. And, the renewables are providing about 25% of the electricity in the country, just by comparison. But what I mean by the industry has been stagnant is also that we have essentially the world's oldest fleet of nuclear power plants in the world, at over 43 years on average, and a growing percentage of reactors that are over 50 years, which is really unprecedented territory. No nuclear plants in the world have ever operated for as long as they are, as the oldest reactors are today. Next slide. So Maryland is squarely within, that sort of, demographic for nuclear energy. We have one nuclear power plant at Calvert Cliffs over on the Western Shore, which is, consists of two reactors, two pressurized water reactors that are each about 50 years old, currently. It generates about 14.8 million megawatt hours a year, which is about 25% of Maryland's annual electricity consumption. Sometimes hear larger percentages, but that's because of the declining amount of electricity that's generated in Maryland. Calvert Cliffs has been a growing percentage of the power that is generated in Maryland. But the plant consumes about 3 billion gallons of water a day, which is which is essentially more water withdrawn from the bay every day than all other industrial users of the bay combined. And there's about more than 1,700 metric tons of irradiated fuel, or what's commonly called nuclear waste, that is stored on site. Next slide. And we have been paying for this plant, for all of these 50 years, but just in the last, quarter century, the amount of subsidies that have gone into Calvert Cliffs operations, both state, federal, and local, has been over $3 billion. And that's actually increasing now since the Inflation Reduction Act was passed and this federal nuclear production credit has gone into effect, which is, could provide essentially $220 million a year of taxpayer revenues from the federal government to Calvert Cliffs. And there's been some legislative proposals in the last couple of years to essentially backstop that federal subsidy after it expires in 2032 with a state program that, basically the equivalent amount. So in a sense, if those policies were to go into place, then direct ratepayer subsidies from Marylanders would be going into the operations of Calvert Cliffs. And this is, typical of what's, the history of the industry. Nuclear power is pound for pound the most heavily subsidized energy source over the last 70 years. And that's from a variety of sources, which I could go into later. But the $716 million that Maryland ratepayers essentially bailed out Calvert Cliffs when deregulation happened in the late 90s, was part of a national trend in which tens of billions of ratepayer dollars were spent to bail out reactors that were going into deregulation. Next slide. So also because Calvert Cliffs is so old, the initial 40-year license for the reactor was already extended to 60 years. Those expire in the mid 2030s. And so Constellation is now planning to try to relicense those reactors again, out to 80 years of operation into the mid 2050s. And this is largely a pro forma process that's administered by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission federally. There is essentially no physical inspections of these aging reactors that are required to get a license extension. Constellation will just have to show that it has what's called an aging management program to basically monitor the condition of the reactors going forward. But there won't be any sort of inspections required to be conducted in order for this next license extension to be implemented. That usually takes about 24 to 30 months for a relicensing application to be completed. But under the Trump administration's policy through the executive orders that were issued last year, that's going to be capped at 12 months to review this. The costs for Constellation are, fairly minimal in terms of nuclear costs. They're going to spend probably several million dollars preparing the application. But they'll also incur regulatory fees for the agency's time to review the application. But there won't, unless there's legal challenges to the license extension, they won't be incurring much in the way of legal costs. And like I said, because there's no inspections required, there's also no capital investments that are necessary to get the license extension. But again, because Calvert Cliffs is such an old plant, there could be, equipment that needs to be replaced as the operation of the reactors go forward, which could cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, depending on what what repairs are required. Now, because we are in a deregulated merchant power market, Constellation is directly responsible for those costs. They don't get to just go and charge ratepayers for it. But indirectly, ratepayers and taxpayers are going to be paying for a lot of, are going to continue paying for a lot of Calvert Cliffs operations through these various subsidy and financing programs. Next slide. So this, in comparison to renewable energy, is quite different. As we all know, the cost of wind and solar and now battery storage has plummeted in the last 20 years. Wind and solar and even wind and solar with storage are now the cheapest energy sources that are available. The opposite has happened with nuclear power. It's, by far the most expensive. And has increased in costs over the years, and that's pretty much true of the industry's track record. The cost that the Lazard, which is the chart that I'm showing here, are based on is the completion of the Vogtle 3 and 4 reactors in Georgia last year, which ended up costing $37 billion and led to an almost 24% rate increase for Georgia Power customers. Next slide. So, but as a result of these trends with renewable energy is growing by leaps and bounds throughout the world. You can see just globally, we're now approaching a million megawatt hours of renewables being deployed in each year going forward. And a similar trend is happening still in the U.S. despite the Trump administration's new policies. Where basically the equivalent of 13 new reactors worth of renewable energy came online last year. Next slide. But we do have a problem with the rate of growth being stymied essentially by this interconnection problem that I think everyone's aware of, both within PJM, but also with other, regions throughout the country, where we have about 2,500 gigawatts, 2.5 million megawatts of renewables and storage that are backed up in these years-long interconnection queues, which are really controlled by the utilities and the transmission line owners. And so, while we're looking at large load growth from, from data centers and the need to basically phase out fossil fuels, we have so much renewable energy and storage, in the queues waiting for these approvals. That the decision by PJM last year to essentially prioritize deployments of fossil fuel and nuclear projects over renewable energy, is just a huge source of the problem that we're facing. Next slide. Now, these trends, with nuclear energy are really sort of just endemic to the industry's whole history. What we saw in what we call the first generation of nuclear power, which was the construction of the current generation of reactors. There were 247 reactors that were proposed, but only 130 were ever completed and operated for any period of time. So it's nearly a 50% cancellation rate of reactor construction projects in the first generation. And then, yes, then 42 of those reactors have since been retired. Um, the construction costs and delays in construction were endemic and actually worsened over time in the first generation, to where construction times grew to over 14 years. And the budgets were basically triple of what their original estimates were. So in some cases, they were more than 10 times their original estimates. Next slide. Now, the industry saw this sort of cliff coming where the reactors were getting older and they weren't building anymore, and so they tried to sort of gin up what they called a nuclear renaissance 20 years ago, and they got for the first time direct subsidies and financing from the federal government to try to sort of stimulate that through billions of dollars of loan guarantees and production credits and whatnot. Um, and in the years after, there were 30 new reactors proposed and, license applications submitted. But those quickly started to be canceled when the cost started to go up. And so only 14 of those licenses ended up being issued. Only four reactors started construction, and the construction of those reactors bankrupted Westinghouse before they were even half built. And so the project in South Carolina was canceled. The one in Georgia continued, but ended up being essentially 7 years late and and $21 billion or $23 billion over budget, over the original budget. And so essentially there was both huge cost increases and a 93% cancellation rate for nuclear projects in the last 20 years. So an even worse track record than in the first generation. So now the industry is talking about sort of new designs of reactors, breaking away from the large, what are called light water reactors, to SMRs, small modular reactors, and other what they're calling advanced reactors. Um, but none of these reactors have a track record. Most of the companies are startups that have never built a reactor before or designed a reactor before. And while there's some of them are sort of, are getting closer to getting a construction permit, like this TerraPower project in Wyoming, they're still, none of them have actually begun construction. And so, so the claims that are being made about the viability and the success of these technologies is really speculative at this point. And they cover a wide range of different types of reactors, none of which are new technologies. These technologies were investigated back in the 50s and 60s, but they were basically determined not to be, really commercially viable then. But the industry is trying to find a needle in the haystack, or some way to resuscitate itself. So next slide. But again, the costs for these new types of reactors are already going up themselves, even though they haven't even begun construction yet. So what you see is, the comparison between the costs of the Vogtle reactors in Georgia, which increased, from the time they were proposed to the time they were completed, basically by double. The cost for some of these leading, sort of SMR or advanced reactor designs are already reaching the level of Vogel's final costs, even though they haven't begun construction yet. And what we know now is also that because of the tariffs and inflation and whatnot, that the costs of any of these things are only going to be increasing in the next several years. So next slide. So the question is, how are these things, how would a nuclear power plant actually get built? And this is the same question that's always been, the industry's, sort of biggest burden or biggest obstacle. And the reality is that essentially, it's always ratepayers and taxpayers that are going to pay for nuclear construction projects, no matter how expensive they are. And so there's what I call the sort of the laws of nuclear economics, which are, basically go like this. The nuclear construction is extremely expensive. The cost increases and delays are expected from the start. But in order to get their initial approvals to go forward, the projects they have to appear to be economical at the start. So they basically the project developers provide unrealistic cost estimates. But these projects are really huge and complicated, even for small modular reactors. These are multi-billion-dollar projects. And so mistakes happen. And the reality is that, in the utility model, those kind of mistakes can actually be profitable. So the incentives are misaligned. Nuclear reactors also take a long time to build, and banks don't want to wait, 10 or 12 years to get paid interest and, on billions of dollars in loans. And so the delays also compound the cost increases that are being passed on to ratepayers that way. Also, governments do not let utility companies go bankrupt, except in really extreme circumstances. And so cover-ups are an attractive alternative, essentially while the scandals are ongoing. And the timeline to the failure of nuclear projects outlasts election cycles. So whoever, approves, reactors, to start construction, they aren't going to be around in government, when those projects are completed and the full cost really hit ratepayers. And the reality is that ratepayers and taxpayers, we have to pay our bills. So, we don't have the option of backing out on the loans or the debts that the utility company has accumulated. And so then, that's why essentially, all of the ways nuclear plants have been financed rely on essentially ratepayers paying all the costs. Next slide. So one of the really significant features of the Next Generation Energy Act that Maryland enacted last year is that it creates a model for how to finance new reactors in a merchant power market. And the reality is that we've been insulated in Maryland for the last quarter of a century from nuclear construction projects because there's no way to recover the cost of construction by selling the power in a competitive market. And so, Constellation proposed building a third reactor at Calvert Cliffs almost 20 years ago. It never happened because the cost would have been so expensive they could have just never paid for it. So the Next Generation Act, it resolves two financing obstacles, essentially sort of basing a nuclear procurement policy on the model that was created in the offshore wind procurement policy. It sets up basically a 30-year contract between whoever the developer is and the Maryland PSC to guarantee the recovery of the construction costs. This can also, by the way, apply to power up rates of reactors, which Constellation is planning for Calvert Cliffs as well. And it would create a non-bypassable surcharge through what they're calling zero emissions credits, which are sort of a moniker for the type of subsidy that states have been providing to nuclear plants in some cases. But it basically the price of these credits would basically just be the gap between what the market is paying for electricity and what the approved costs are for the nuclear project. Next slide. So essentially what the act does is it puts some responsibilities on the Maryland Energy Administration and the PSC. The MEA is directed to pursue what they call cost sharing agreements with neighboring states. It's not clear why other states would want to share Maryland's cost for an expensive nuclear plant, so I wouldn't expect much in that regard. But it directs the PSC to do some concrete things. One is that it has to accept a proposal from a developer to build new reactors, and then open a period for other developers to basically, sort of submit proposals that could be cost competitive with that, and then select the winning project. And then it has to do that twice more by 2031. And then it also tells the PSC that it has to set some pricing standards, essentially to limit, to set basically a cap for how much ratepayers could be affected by this. But the PSC has to keep those figures confidential. So we would never know essentially what an acceptable cost of a reactor the PSC would consider. Next slide. It also sets some public benefit standards for nuclear projects that have to be considered, but these are all framed as essentially the benefits of a project, not an evaluation of its other impacts, environmental impacts, environmental justice impacts, and whatnot, only to consider the benefits of a nuclear project. It does create a couple of important limitations, which is that it prohibits payments for the reactor's costs until the reactor is actually online and generating electricity. And I'll just say that I don't think that any nuclear plant in the country has been built under such a policy. Um, you know, because the long construction times, ratepayers are generally charged for the cost while the construction is ongoing. But it also says that ratepayers in the state would be, quote, held harmless for cost overruns on a project. Next slide. But what this does is it creates a model for building new reactors in states with deregulated power markets. And so I sort of expect that there's going to be copycat legislation in some other states. The partial cost controls in the act are a good foresight, but they provide some false assurances. And namely, it's that the approved cost that the PSC sets can be amended if there's a cost over. And that is in fact what happens in every case where there has been nuclear cost overruns, is that, for instance, in Georgia, the PSC reviewed the progress on construction and the cost every 6 months for those 12 years that it was 13 years that it was under construction. It just consistently raised the bar when Georgia Power came in and said the costs had gone. And there's nothing to prevent that from happening, under this policy either. Um, and I think another side, sort of side impact of this is that the PSC is now going to be potentially tied up, having to review these nuclear proposals, which are going to be extremely complex. They're going to require a lot of staff time. That the PSC, which has, I think we all know has limited capacity, could and should be spending on, advancing the state's renewable energy targets. So I think there's probably some misaligned priorities for the PSC in this as well. Next slide. Now, there's a lot of talk around all of this in terms of these advanced reactors or advanced nuclear. And so the question is, what is advanced nuclear? And the reality is there is no consistent definition. This is really sort of a marketing term that's been created for a wide range of reactor technologies that include also large light water reactors like the ones that were built in Georgia, the type of reactors that we're most familiar with, as well as SMRs, both light water SMRs and non-light water SMRs, as well as also micro reactors. These, sort of neighborhood scale, sort of megawatt to 10 megawatt style reactors. Next slide. But there's also a lot of claims being made that these reactors are inherently safer, and that's not necessarily true. There have been small reactors, using some of these same technologies, sodium coolant, graphite coolant, that have had significant releases of radiation historically and have contaminated communities and led to serious problems. And so, the fact that these reactors are smaller and use different types of technology doesn't mean that the safety of the community is going to be inherently protected. They also generally would create more nuclear waste per amount of electricity. So there was a study out of Stanford by a former nuclear regulatory commissioner that found that these new reactors could generate 2 to 30 times more radioactive waste per megawatt than the current generation of reactors do. Next slide. But one of the big use cases that's been talked about is to power data centers and these large load growths that are projected from AI and crypto. And so you've probably heard a lot of deals announced in the last year between various major tech companies and various nuclear companies. There's a lot of, I mean, the reality is that very few of these deals actually involve providing nuclear generated electricity to data centers in the near future. In fact, there's only one major deal in which nuclear power is being provided to a data center, and that's at an Amazon data center located at a nuclear plant in northern Pennsylvania, called Susquehanna. But if you go through the deals that have been talked about a lot, like the restart of the Three Mile Island 1 reactor, which is contingent on a bunch of regulatory approvals that haven't come through, or the construction of a bunch of small modular reactors that, again, haven't been approved, aren't under construction, are years away from being built. What's very clear is that the data centers are being built today, but it's going to be years and years and years before any nuclear power plants could even be built to power them. And a lot of that is also dependent on the industry showing that it can keep costs down to an affordable level, and or the government basically sort of what they call de-risking or bailing out these projects when the costs get too high. So, but when we're talking about, I think we've all been becoming really familiar with the impacts that data centers have on communities, especially AI data centers and crypto data centers. When you start talking about combining nuclear power plants with that, the environmental impacts, start to amplify really dramatically. So, the largest data centers that are in operation and being planned today are in the 100 to 650 megawatt size, which is a huge power demand. It's massive. And the amount of growth in that sector is also really huge, projected to be 50 gigawatts of additional data centers by 2030, maybe up to 80 gigawatts by 2035. Nuclear reactors, whether it's an SMR or a large reactor, generate between 300 and 1100 megawatts. So you'd be talking about building hundreds of nuclear plants to meet any significant portion of those new loads. Which again, no construction is happening now. It would have to ramp up, incredibly fast to do any of that. In fact, it takes 3 to 4 years to build an AI data center, whereas, it takes about 12 to 17 years to plan and build a nuclear power plant. And then in terms of water consumption, I think we're aware that data centers, especially AI data centers, consume a tremendous amount of water, mostly for cooling. And so that is on average about 550,000 gallons of water withdrawn from like a river or an aquifer. They lose about 440,000 of that to evaporation. A large reactor, or reactors of basically any size are many times more water than that. So if you're going to build SMRs or a large reactor to power your big AI data center, you're talking about, much more significant impacts on the water resource as well. Next slide. Now, these are just some slides that are, sort of basics on, nuclear energy and the environmental impacts of nuclear energy. And so I'm going to stop here for question and answers. And then these slides will be available with the slide deck so you can get the other part of the story.
Great. Thank you, Tim. That was really informative and a lot of good numbers there to digest and understand. I appreciate your insight on that. We do have a couple questions that came in. Nuclear is expensive to build, but Calvert Cliffs is generating a huge amount of energy on a very small footprint. What is the cost per kilowatt of hour for a plant like Calvert Cliffs compared to a LNG plant, especially if you factor in the costs, both health and environmental, of CO2 generated by these other sources?
Well, I think it's hard to sort of calculate in the cost of CO2. There's not really a mechanism to do that. But I think we don't really know what the cost of operating Calvert Cliffs is. Now, Constellation has said a number of times in recent years that it deserves a subsidy. right, in order to in order to cover its costs and to ensure that it continues operating. So I think, what we're looking at is, average costs of reactors are going up as they get older. But the industry doesn't provide any actual figures that are really transparent or reliable about their costs.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes it hard to understand there. Do you have concerns that NRC has become a captured agency and the Trump administration will be putting pressure for fast approval before safety measures are assured?
So the NRC, most of the environmental movement has been really, really critical of the NRC for a long time. They've been a captive agency for decades. But what the administration has done in the last year has essentially sort of, really gone past, any sort of sort of limit of reason. The NRC has been doged just like all these other federal agencies have. Um, so this directive, to the NRC, to complete licensing of new reactors within 18 months. It's not clear that you can do an adequate technical safety review of a new reactor that's never been built before in 18 months. But that's the expectation that's put on the NRC now, and to do it with much fewer staff. And so what we're seeing at the same time is, these directives are being put on NRC to expedite licensing approvals, is that the staff has been cut and the staff available to do inspections of reactors, right, which are essentially how, a lot of the promotion of nuclear energy has relied on the idea that we have a strong regulator who's doing inspections and ensuring that reactors are safe. There can be no expectation of that.
Yeah, that actually leads into another question here. So, thinking about extending the life of old nuclear power plants and the risks that those that brings, does Maryland have the authority to inspect these power plants, these
No.
old ones? How do we change that?
You can't. I mean, this is an area that's, essentially preempted by the Atomic Energy Act, which gives the federal government, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the sole authority to regulate the safety of reactors. So there
Mhm.
have been states that have, sort of intervened to try to, sort of affect the operations of reactors. Those have had limited success. But there is no direct regulatory role the state can provide over nuclear safety.
That's unfortunate to hear. Question about the PSC. So, why do they allow pricing to be a secret? And to further that, how can we hold the PSC accountable? It seems as if that when the PSC reviews costs, it seems too high level, not a line item. And so there's no way to judge the cost efficiency or areas for improvement beyond looking at total costs. Is there a way to address this?
Well, I think greater transparency, is really important. I think the problem that they probably looked at with, and when they wrote the Next Gen Act, is if the PSC says what its cost limit is, then it could be controversial because maybe the public thinks it's too high. And then there'd be pressure on the PSC to basically not do what the act requires, which is to approve a project. But the other thing is that it might also basically sort of rig the bidding that companies do when they propose their project's cost. If they knew how much was too much, then they might just propose something that's lower than that, even though they know it's going to cost more.
Yeah. Um, okay, another question here about the waste from nuclear power plants. Uh, do nuclear power plants generate different grades of waste that might require different levels of safeguards in the
Well,
disposal?
there are different classifications for radioactive waste. So when I talked about the 1,700 tons of irradiated fuel that's stored, that's called high level radioactive waste. That's the most intensely radioactive waste, that's generated. But there's a wide stream of different other radioactive waste that the plants produce. Some of which they release directly into the bay and into the air. Some of which they ship off site for disposal. These are what typically called low-level radioactive waste, but that you know, it's not necessarily low levels of radioactivity. It's just lower than the highest stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, that wraps up our question portion here, Tim, of everything that came through. I'd encourage you to put your contact or your website in the chat for the
Yeah, if
attendees
you
to
go to the
see.
last slide too, it's there as well.
Yeah. Do you have a couple more slides here? Did you want to? leave these for the
Uh,
viewers to look at on the recorder?
Sure, yeah. So this is just sort of an overview of the way the nuclear fuel chain. This is, the nuclear fuel chain is similar to the fossil fuel chain. They don't just put uranium into a reactor. It goes through, it's a long process of extraction that produces a ton of other radioactive waste. Um, and so that's why we call it the uranium fuel chain. It goes from mining uranium in the ground to making it into fuel to what happens when the reactor shuts down. If you go to
Hmm.
the next slide, um, this is what that looks like. In uranium mining, they produce a tremendous amount of radioactive waste from pulling the uranium out. Essentially, what you end up with is 5,000 pounds of radioactive waste just from the mining for every pound of fuel that goes into a reactor. And mostly that is dumped at the mining site. And so this is mostly on indigenous land. And so we have 15,000 abandoned uranium mines in the US, which are essentially, just left there to not, and have never been cleaned up.
Yeah.
Then you have to refine and mill the uranium. It's enriched to make it fissile for the reactor. And that creates a whole other stream of what's called depleted uranium that is several times more than the fuel that comes out. And then they fabricate it into fuel, which is those communities are contaminated as well.
Hmm.
And the next slide. And then you sort of go to the back end, which is, the fuel goes to the reactor, it's put into the reactor. It becomes intensely radioactive by the splitting of the atoms and the fission process, produces a lot of other radioactive waste. It's also released into the environment. There was just a study by the Harvard School of Public Health that was published last month, that looked at the cancer rates within proximity to nuclear reactors, and found that there's a significant correlation between people who live within 25 to 30 kilometers of a reactor and the cancer rates. And they tested that against other possible factors and found that it was probably related to the emissions from the reactor. Then when the reactor shuts down, essentially the entire plant becomes radioactive waste and has to be decommissioned and remediated. That is expensive itself, usually costs more than $1 billion per reactor. And then you're left with the irradiated fuel, which, there is no repository program in operation in the US to build a permanent repository for this waste. And so it's going to be sitting, at Calvert Cliffs and at other reactor sites pretty much indefinitely.
Hmm.
And I think a significant issue to consider with new reactors is that who's going to bear the cost of that storage? Because, under a sort of a bad policy decision made in the 1990s, the federal government is basically reimbursing the industry for most of their costs for storing the waste that the existing reactors are producing. But new reactors aren't going to benefit from that policy. And so, as we're talking, as you'd be looking at decades of storing nuclear waste, maybe centuries of storing nuclear waste at reactor sites or data centers or wherever, who's going to pay the cost of that?
Hmm. It's a good question. Yeah. And your last slide here to close it out.
Yeah. So, this is sort of leading you to the conclusion that we have come to, which is that um, nuclear power is too dirty, too dangerous, too expensive, and too slow to be a reasonable, sort of energy solution for the climate crisis. And that's also because it's rooted in environmental justice and human rights violations. All those radioactive waste that I talked about, impact, communities like indigenous communities and other communities of color. And you have the intergenerational harm for this waste that has no solution.
Right. Well, Tim, I just want to thank you. I learned an incredible amount here.